Hi, I'm Dr. Mike Evangel. I'm a chiropractic physician for the last 34 years. I'm also the host of the Super Mike Show. I am the host, but this is not my show. This is your show. This is your survival guide to life. We cover topics such as health, fitness, nutrition, longevity, and the environment. Why do you need a survival guide? There's so much misinformation out there today. How are you going to believe what to know, who to listen to? It's very confusing. For example, is a plant-based diet the best, or a diet with both plant and animal sources? Very controversial. Each and every episode will cut through the misinformation and the confusion and deliver the truth to you. With that truth, you can take it, share it with others. When you do that, you'll be their holistic hero. With that in mind, let's look at the topic for today. Vaccine injuries. When I was a kid, nobody had a peanut allergy. Never heard of it. Today, allergies, autoimmune diseases, asthma, learning disabilities, they're all over the place, okay? They're common when they used to be very rare. The human genetic makeup has not changed since I was a kid. It hasn't changed in a long time, but the environment has. Tens of thousands of chemicals in the environment now that weren't in the environment 100 years ago. Autism is at epidemic proportions right now. When I was a child, 1 in 10,000 children were autistic. If the numbers keep on going like they're going, by the year 2032, projections are 1 in 6 children will be autistic. When I was a kid, half a dozen vaccines by the time we were 18 years of age. Now, the CDC is recommending 72 vaccine doses by the time somebody's 18 years of age, and 36 by the time they're 18 months of age. After the commercial break, we'll meet Robert Krakow, one of the top vaccine injury attorneys in the country. See you after the break. Our guest today is Robert Krakow. He's an attorney based out of New York City. He graduated in 1979 from George Washington University Law School in Washington, D.C. He's handled a lot of cases, both civil and criminal, over the years, both in state and federal courts. Over 100 contested cases where there are trials or possibly arbitration. And then he's concerned himself with vaccine injuries as being a particular interest. We'll find out why in a few minutes. He's been representing individuals and families of vaccine injured children, and they go in front of the vaccine injury courts. We'll find out a lot about that and the vaccine injury protocols and guides. All of this will be gone into detail. So what I'd like to do is introduce you to our guest, Robert Krakow. Thank you for being on the show.
Thank you, Mike.
Great to have you here.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Well, first of all, I'd like to start off with, when you were a kid, did you always want to be a lawyer?
I don't remember.
You don't remember?
But I know early on.
So you had an affinity towards law.
I had an affinity toward politics and law and social issues, and I guess law is one of the areas you go into if you want to pursue those types of things. And 40 years later, here I am. So it's been an interesting career. It's going to continue for a long time, I hope. And doing something now which I believe in, and which is what I always wanted to do. I wanted to do something I believed in. I remember from an early age as a teenager, and I was an activist in high school. I led a march out, a strike in my high school against the bombing in Cambodia in I think it was 1970. Mm-hmm. So I always believed in taking action, and law sometimes gives you that opportunity. Other times you have to adhere to a lot of rules, and so it's been an interesting journey. I started out working for a Ralph Nader organization my first year out of law school, and then I went to the district attorney in New York County under Robert Morgenthau, and I became I was a drug prosecutor for the decade of the 80s. Mm-hmm. And what I usually say about that is I realized when I got to the 2000s, the turn of the millennium, I was prosecuting the wrong drug dealers, because I discovered that something called vaccine injury through a personal experience with a family member. And I said, okay, now I could go after the real drug dealers, vaccine manufacturers, as opposed to the 80s when we were going unsuccessfully against cocaine dealers and crack dealers. And then I found out all too soon that the Supreme Court of the United States ruled that you couldn't sue the vaccine manufacturers except in very limited circumstances, which if we get to it, I'd be happy to talk about today. Because the vaccine manufacturers have, probably the only other industry that has this is the firearm industry. They have immunity from almost all lawsuits because the government has determined that vaccines are so important that we can't allow lawsuits to damage the vaccine manufacturers, so they pull out of the market, supposedly. And this goes to the origin of the Vaccine Act, which I think we'll talk about too.
Right. Cases are much different from other cases in law or having to do with any sort of malpractice. Can you go into a little detail about how?
They weren't different until 1988. What happened was in the early 80s, parents started complaining that their children were injured by vaccines, mostly by the DPT, diphtheria, pertussis, tetanus vaccine. And they actually organized, and there was a famous television program, Lee Thompson, Vaccine Roulette, and she was almost drummed out of the industry for making this movie. But the activism of the parents, but also the lawsuits, caused the vaccine manufacturers to threaten to leave the market. And our government felt that was so important, it was then the cornerstone of public health, even more so today, that they proposed something called the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act, NCVIA for short. That gave unprecedented immunity for lawsuits against lawsuits.
That was in 1986?
It was passed in 86, it was signed by Ronald Reagan, it went into effect in 1988. Mm-hmm. Since then, things have changed dramatically because that provided the green light for vaccine manufacturers to expand the vaccine schedule. So I think you said 24 vaccines in the 80s, but I think that number is probably around right. Today we have 3 times as many. Why? Because the vaccine manufacturers can introduce more and more vaccines. So in the 90s, hepatitis, in the 80s with the MMR, DPT, smallpox was being given then. That's not given anymore. But in the 90s, once the vaccine went into place, and I believe this was a long-range strategic plan by the vaccine industry, hepatitis B, hepatitis A, varicella, on down the list. Now the flu shot is mandated, Gardasil is recommended, sometimes mandated. So this has been a long 30 to 40 year trend that was orchestrated, I believe, by the vaccine industry, and the Vaccine Act was the handmaiden that ushered in and allowed the vaccine industry to do this.
We'll get into a lot more information about vaccine injuries right after this break. And we're back. We're talking about how vaccine injuries differ from any other thing in medicine or in law. Now, where does the money come from that goes into the compensation fund?
It comes from an excise tax placed on every vaccine that's collected when the vaccine is purchased. 75 cents for every antigen. There's a fund in which the money goes. It's more than $4 billion in that fund now. That's the source of the funds that's used to pay victims of vaccine injury, pay the lawyers who represent the victims of vaccine injury, and finance the entire program. That's where it comes from.
And they started off with 7 vaccines on that list, and now it's 15.
At least that. I think it's more than that.
It might be more.
Recommended that once it's approved, then the 75 cents comes in. So MMR, $2.25 for every MMR given goes to that fund.
Okay, so it's you get 3 doses, so it's 3
That's right.
taxes on that.
3 antigens. So that is the source of the funding. That's where vaccine injury victims are compensated. And vaccine injury is not rare. We don't know how common it is. But one thing to emphasize here, the fact that vaccine injury occurs is the policy of the United States government. It's not controversial. It's understood. It's the policy. It's in the law. Vaccine injury happens. And we don't know how often because that hasn't been well studied. But you hear criticism of false information being promulgated on Google and online and so on, lies about that. That's ridiculous. Vaccine injury occurs. The best statistic I can give you about that came from a federal judge in a case that reported on the vaccine injuries in the 80s. It was estimated, or it was reported in the hearings, 0.5% of all individuals who get vaccines get injured.
Wow.
So that's 4 million children a year are born. 1/2 of 1%, that's about 20,000 injuries per year. Now we have 3 times as many vaccines, so it's going to be greater than 20,000. How much, we don't know. Let's say it's 40,000. Every year, 40,000 vaccine injuries. Multiply that by 30 years since the vaccine, 35 years. We have well over 1 million people who have been injured by vaccines, and that's probably an underestimate. But that's not studied. That information the government doesn't want you to hear. The government actually confessed that they have a conflict. They want to promote vaccines because that's the cornerstone of public health, but they don't want to promote vaccine injury. So the law, the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act, requires publicity about vaccine injury in the Vaccine Act. But you don't see much publicity about it because the government's admitted they don't promote it because it would conflict with their mission, CDC and HHS, to promote vaccines. And let me just say something else. I'm not anti-vaccine, I'm not pro-vaccine. I don't even think of it that way. I think it's a matter of choice. Individuals should have a choice to choose whether or not they have this vaccine, and the information should be out there, and parents and individuals and more adults should have the opportunity to choose whether or not they get the vaccine.
Well, information out there, for example, when a child gets a vaccine, the parents are not given the papers for informed consent.
Actually, the vaccine information sheet is required to be given to parents every time a child gets a vaccine. However, it's honored in the breach. It's usually not done.
Right.
And in there's all the information about the Vaccine Act. If a parent read that and studied it or was told it explicitly, I think they'd have a lot more concern about the routine vaccines their children are getting.
Well, maybe that's why it's not given out, because...
Maybe. I can't speak for why pediatricians do what they do, but usually it's in and out. You know, you go into a pediatrician's office, you're here for your vaccines, get the vaccines, and you leave. And there are other vaccines now that the laws are starting to require that allow children to get vaccines under 18 without the parents' consent. This is a very damaging trend that tends to divide parents from children.
Right.
And also, as a child, how can a child of 15 years old provide informed consent? These are very disturbing trends. And for anybody, not someone who's opposed to vaccines, vaccines might have utility. I'm here as a lawyer, so I'm not going to talk about that.
Well, everything we do, everything we don't do, there's a risk to doing something and there's a risk of not doing something. But a lot of times we like to play the odds, but there's no guarantee when you play the odds, you'll come up on the high end of the probabilities.
Vaccines, no doubt, carry risk. It's the policy of the government that they carry risk, that injuries occur, as I mentioned before.
Right.
And the question is, does the benefit outweigh the risk?
Exactly.
And that gets into a very difficult discussion where the government doesn't really want you to look at that. They just say, benefit outweighs the risk, get the vaccine. I think one person on TV once said, get the damn vaccine.
Right. More about vaccines after this break. And we're back. Is it difficult to establish a cause and effect relationship between the injury and the vaccine? It's
very difficult. In fact, it's axiomatic in the law that medicine does not understand how vaccines affect the human body. That's a principle that's been applied to make it easier, supposedly, in the vaccine program to prove cause and effect. You don't have to prove it to a scientific certainty. That would be impossible. Okay, that's causality. Causation in the vaccine court is supposedly a lower standard. But if you read the decisions and the minute detail into which 100-page decisions go into whether the vaccine caused an injury, you'd understand how difficult it is to prove, because we just don't have the medicine. Medicine does not understand how vaccines work. We know more and more. We know about genetic susceptibility now that we didn't know about maybe 10, 15 years ago, still very difficult to prove.
Is this a judge or are there juries involved in vaccine court?
It's actually neither. There's no jury, there's no discovery, there's a cap on damages. There's a lawyer is appointed, there's a group of 8 lawyers appointed to be special masters. They answer to the judges, but they make the decisions. On appeal, it's very different, a very deferential standard. So whatever they say carries a lot of weight, and it's very hard to disturb that. Now, I have a lot of respect for everyone participating in the program, the special masters, the lawyers on the other side. They're executing a job, but there's a structural problem with the way the law is set up, because the administration of the law is by the Health and Human Services Department, the government. And they have an interest, as I said before, in promoting vaccines. So is the program fair? There's a lot of controversy about that, a lot of controversy about whether there's truly due process. So this is an issue that creates a very challenging environment for a lawyer.
Another very challenging issue is the consideration of religious exemption. Do you want to talk about that? Because California got rid of it and Florida is trying to.
New York just repealed it. And I find that particularly offensive. What was offensive in part is that the legislators did not respect people who had the religious exemption and actually felt that they were perpetrating a fraud. Everyone who had a religious exemption in New York had it because they went through a sincerity test and they're found to have a sincere belief. It doesn't matter whether an organized religious rabbi, priest, cleric approved it. If you had a sincere belief, that's gone now. That means parents have no recourse. They have to get the vaccine or their kids can't go to school. And we're going through that right now in New York. There were multiple lawsuits challenging the repeal. And New York was the second to fall after California was the first. And I think you could see the political complexion of those states. And being a long time, I don't know if we want to get into politics, but being a long time Democrat, the Democrats seem to think that vaccines should be mandated. There's an authoritarian streak there. It wasn't necessary. 96% of children were vaccinated in New York then and now. There was no need to take the small number of children and families that had religious exemptions and say, no, your kids can't go to school. But that's what happened. I think eventually New York and the legislators will regret that action. It's causing tremendous disruption in the schools right now, how to implement it. There was no provision for implementation.
Now, I'm not an attorney, but in my opinion, it's a violation of the First Amendment, freedom of religion.
The prevailing law is not in accord with that. Right now, the First Amendment says there is no right to a religious exemption because public health, safety, and the police power of the state supersedes that. That's a case that was decided in 1905, Jacobson versus Massachusetts. So we have no First Amendment rights, although those are being asserted now. We'll see how that plays out in the courts. Things have changed since 1905. So we know more than we did then. There were many more vaccines. Then it was the smallpox vaccine. And smallpox was much more serious than almost all the diseases that vaccines protect against today. So I'm sad to give you the news that we do not have a First Amendment right under the law of the land right now to object to vaccines due to religious beliefs.
Now,
sad but true.
There's probably a lot of people out there that have children or themselves that were vaccine injured. Are there a group of attorneys? Where can they go to get more information to try to get in contact with somebody to try to take care of?
Well, there's a growing number of attorneys and organizations that work on these issues, and we have a group of lawyers, but I'm happy for people to contact me, and I'll make sure they get to the right place. We have great advocates working very hard every day, and they can contact me at my, go to my website, krakowlaw.com, KRAKOWLAW.com.
One last question I have,
Sure.
As far as when you've been going through the years and you've seen changes, have you seen a lot more cases come up in recent years?
Well, in fact, that is happening. So in the early 2000s, there were the group of autism cases. There were 5,000 cases filed, completely unsuccessful because it's so difficult to prove, for anyone to prove what causes that, and there are multiple causes. But the court had to reject those cases because that would undermine everything. It would undermine the foundation of Western civilization if they agreed that vaccines cause autism. But putting that aside, in 2010, 11, there were maybe 500-600 cases a year. The last few years, there's been as many as 2,000 cases filed per year. I think that's the tip of the iceberg because I don't think people generally still know that there's a vaccine injury program, and doctors aren't trained to recognize what vaccine injury is. So someone gets injured, it's attributed to something else, it's not attributed to the vaccine, and even if it is, most doctors don't know there's a vaccine program. They're the first line of information. However, because of the controversy over vaccines and because of the advocates, and they're trying to shut them down on the internet now, people are becoming more aware. I had one client contact me saying, "Oh, I just heard about this on NPR. They had 2 weeks left to file. There's a 3-year statute of limitation. Thank God they had a program on it," which was basically criticizing the idea that vaccine injuries occur, and we successfully handled her case. So she saw it. How many are missing it? How many are missing the deadlines?
Right. Well, we could talk for hours on this, but thank you very much for being a guest on the
My
show.
pleasure. Great for the
pleasure.
Thank you for the opportunity.
It's good to get the truth out there. And there is only one truth. Each and every episode, we'll do our best to deliver that truth to you with the hope that you and your loved ones can live healthier, safer, and more fulfilling lives. I'm Dr. Mike, and thanks for watching our show. Until next time,